In the sweltering heat of the South African veldt on January 22, 1879, 150 British soldiers received news that would chill their blood despite the scorching sun. 4,000 Zulu warriors were marching toward their remote mission station at Rorke's Drift. The main British force had been annihilated at nearby Isandlwana, leaving this small garrison as the only obstacle between the victorious Zulu army and the undefended colony of Natal. What followed over the next 12 hours would become one of the most extraordinary defensive battles in military history, where ordinary men were transformed into legends through their refusal to surrender against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant John Chard wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the construction of the pontoon bridge across the Buffalo River. The Royal Engineers officer had been sent to this remote outpost of Rorke's Drift with what seemed like a routine assignment, but the morning of January 22, 1879, was about to change everything he thought he knew about duty and survival. The mission station sat like a small island of civilization in the vast wilderness of Natal, South Africa. Named after James Rorke, an Irish trader who had established a drift or ford across the Buffalo River, the station consisted of several buildings including a storehouse, a hospital, and the missionary Otto Witt's residence. The location served as a crucial supply depot for the British forces operating deeper into Zulu territory under Lord Chelmsford's command. Chard had arrived only days earlier, finding the station occupied by B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, under the command of Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. The two officers had barely had time to become acquainted when their world was turned upside down by the arrival of desperate messengers from the main column. The first rider came thundering across the veld at midday, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Lieutenant Adendorf of the Natal Native contingent brought news that struck the small garrison like a physical blow. The main British force had been attacked at Isandlwana, and the battle was going badly. But it was the second messenger arriving an hour later who brought the full horror of what had occurred. "Isandlwana has fallen," gasped the exhausted trooper as he slid from his saddle. "The entire column has been wiped out. Lord Chelmsford's force is scattered, and 4,000 Zulu warriors are heading this way." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chard felt the blood drain from his face as the implications became clear. They were cut off, surrounded, and facing an enemy force that had just achieved one of the most complete military victories in colonial warfare. The logical response would be immediate evacuation, but Lieutenant Chard quickly realized that retreat was impossible. The wounded in the hospital could not be moved, and there were civilian families at the mission who depended on their protection. Moreover, abandoning the strategic crossing point would leave the entire Natal colony defenseless. As the senior officer present, the burden of decision fell on Chard's shoulders, despite his lack of infantry experience. Bromhead, though junior in service, commanded the respect of his men through his steady demeanor and proven courage. When Chard consulted him about their options, the infantry lieutenant's response was immediate and unwavering. "We'll fight them, sir. The men won't run, and neither will we." The next few hours became a frantic race against time as the small garrison prepared for what seemed certain to be their final battle. Acting Commissary James Dalton, a former sergeant major with extensive experience of frontier warfare, became invaluable in organizing the defense. His knowledge of Zulu tactics and the terrain around the mission station provided crucial insights into how they might survive the coming assault. Dalton suggested creating a defensive perimeter using the existing buildings and the supplies stacked around the compound. Mealie bags, heavy sacks of corn, were dragged from the storehouse and stacked to create makeshift walls. Wooden boxes and wagons were incorporated into the barrier, creating a rough rectangular fortification around the main buildings. The men worked with desperate efficiency, understanding that their lives depended on completing these preparations before the Zulu force arrived. Privates like Frederick Hitch and Robert Jones, veterans of previous campaigns, took charge of groups of younger soldiers, showing them how to create firing positions and prepare their ammunition for the coming battle. As afternoon wore on, the defensive preparations took shape. The hospital, a single-story building with thick stone walls, was converted into a secondary stronghold. Loopholes were knocked through the walls to allow the defenders to fire from within, while the patients who could handle weapons were given rifles and positioned at strategic points. The main defensive line stretched between the storehouse and the hospital, incorporating a stone wall that ran along part of the perimeter. This wall, originally built to contain cattle, now served as the foundation for their improvised fortress. Behind this barrier, ammunition boxes were distributed at regular intervals, ensuring that the defenders would not run short of cartridges during the expected prolonged engagement. Private Henry Hook, who had been assigned to hospital duty, found himself in charge of the most vulnerable part of the defense. The hospital building, while solid, had multiple rooms connected by narrow passages, making it difficult to defend effectively. Hook realized that if the Zulus penetrated the building, the wounded men inside would be trapped and helpless. Working alongside Acting Assistant Commissary Walter Dunn and other hospital staff, Hook began planning evacuation routes through the building. They identified walls that could be broken through if necessary, allowing movement between rooms even if corridors were blocked. This preparation would prove crucial in the hours to come. As evening approached, the sound of distant drums began to echo across the veldt. The Zulu army was announcing its approach with the traditional war songs that had struck fear into their enemies for generations. The rhythm grew steadily louder, accompanied by the thunderous stamping of thousands of feet moving in unison across the landscape. Chard climbed onto the roof of the storehouse to observe the approaching enemy. What he saw in the distance defied his ability to fully comprehend. The Zulu force appeared as a dark mass stretching across the horizon, their cowhide shields and assegai spears glinting in the late afternoon sun. They moved with the disciplined precision of a military machine, their advance coordinated by experienced commanders who had just won a crushing victory against British regulars. The sight should have filled any rational man with despair, but Chard felt a strange calm descend over him. The decision had been made, the preparations were complete, and there was nothing left but to face whatever was coming with courage and determination. He climbed down from his vantage point and walked among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement and checking their readiness for battle. Bromhead was doing the same on the other side of the compound, his calm presence helping to steady the nerves of soldiers who had never faced anything like the force now approaching their position. The lieutenant had positioned his most experienced men at crucial points along the perimeter, knowing that their steadiness would be essential in maintaining the defense when the assault began. As darkness began to fall, the Zulu army took position around the mission station. Their discipline was evident in how they deployed without confusion despite the fading light. Different regiments took up positions covering all approaches to the British position, ensuring that there would be no possibility of escape once the battle commenced. The waiting became almost unbearable as both sides prepared for the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone at Rorke's Drift. In the distance, the Zulu warriors could be heard chanting and singing, building their courage for the assault they knew would cost many lives. Inside the improvised fortress, British soldiers checked their rifles one final time and said quiet prayers to whatever deity might be listening. The stage was set for a battle that would test human endurance to its absolute limits, where 150 men would face odds of more than 25 to 1, and where the outcome would depend not just on weapons and tactics, but on the deepest reserves of courage that ordinary men could summon when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The first shots rang out just as the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, plunging the mission station into the uncertain light of dusk. Private Frederick Hitch, positioned at the corner of the storehouse, had spotted the advanced scouts of the Zulu force moving through the tall grass barely 100 yards from the perimeter. His Martini Henry rifle cracked sharply in the evening air, and one of the shadowy figures dropped to the ground. That single shot served as the signal for the beginning of what would become one of the longest nights in British military history. Within moments, the entire Zulu force emerged from the gathering darkness, their war cries echoing across the veld as thousands of warriors charged toward the hastily constructed defenses. Lieutenant Chard felt his heart racing as he watched the human wave approaching their position. The Zulu warriors moved with terrifying speed and coordination, their traditional battle formation spreading across the landscape like spilled ink. The center force, composed mainly of married veterans carrying white shields, advanced directly toward the main defensive line, while younger regiments with black shields swept around the flanks in the classic Horns of the Buffalo formation that had brought them victory at Isandlwana. "Steady, men. Wait for my command." Bromhead's voice cut through the rising din as his soldiers took aim along the perimeter wall. The lieutenant had positioned himself where he could observe the entire defensive line, ready to reinforce any point that came under severe pressure. The defenders held their fire until the charging warriors came within 50 yards of the barricade. Then Bromhead's command rang out, "Fire!" The coordinated volley from 60 rifles created a wall of flame and smoke along the perimeter, sending dozens of Zulu warriors tumbling to the ground. But the assault continued without pause, the fallen warriors immediately replaced by others who leapfrogged over their bodies and continued the charge. The Martini Henry rifles used by the British forces were single-shot weapons that required reloading after each discharge. This created brief intervals during which the defenders were vulnerable, but the experience of the 24th Regiment soldiers showed in their smooth, practiced loading drill. As soon as one rank fired, they dropped back to reload, while a second rank stepped forward to maintain continuous fire. Private Robert Jones found himself at one of the most exposed positions, where the perimeter wall was lowest, and the attacking Zulus could come closest to the defenses. A veteran of the Ninth Cape Frontier War, Jones had faced Zulu warriors before, but never in such overwhelming numbers. His rifle grew hot in his hands as he fired round after round into the mass of attacking figures, the smell of gunpowder filling his nostrils and stinging his eyes. The courage of individual Zulu warriors became evident as the assault developed. Despite the devastating rifle fire, they continued to press forward, some advancing to within spear-throwing distance of the barricades. Their traditional weapons, the assegai spear and knobkerrie club, required them to close with their enemies, making their advance all the more courageous in the face of modern rifles. Acting Commissary Dalton proved invaluable during these opening exchanges, moving along the firing line to distribute ammunition and offer encouragement to the defenders. His knowledge of Zulu tactics allowed him to anticipate where the next assault would fall, helping Chard and Bromhead position their limited manpower most effectively. The hospital building became a particular focus of Zulu attention as the evening progressed. The warriors could see that the structure contained non-combatants, making it an attractive target for breakthrough attempts. Private Henry Hook, defending one of the hospital rooms with several wounded patients, found himself facing an increasingly desperate situation as Zulu warriors began to probe the building's defenses. The thick stone walls of the hospital provided excellent protection against spear attacks, but the windows and doors remained vulnerable points. Hook and his comrades had blocked most openings with furniture and medical supplies, creating improvised firing positions that allowed them to engage attackers while remaining relatively protected. As the first assault wave was repulsed, the defenders had little time to celebrate their success. The Zulu commanders quickly reorganized their forces for another attack, demonstrating the military sophistication that had made them such formidable opponents. Different regiments were brought forward to replace those that had taken casualties, ensuring that the pressure on the British position remained constant. The second assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, stretching the defenders' ability to respond effectively. Chard realized that his men were already beginning to show signs of fatigue, despite the battle being only an hour old. The physical demands of continuous rifle fire, combined with the stress of facing overwhelming odds, were taking their toll on soldiers who had been working frantically to prepare defenses all afternoon. Bromhead adapted quickly to the changing situation, creating a mobile reserve of his most experienced soldiers who could be rushed to any point along the perimeter that came under severe pressure. This flexible approach to defense allowed the outnumbered garrison to meet each assault with concentrated firepower, but it also meant that men were constantly moving between positions under enemy fire. The darkness that had initially seemed like a disadvantage for the defenders proved to work in their favor as the battle progressed. The Zulu warriors, accustomed to fighting in daylight, found it difficult to coordinate their attacks effectively in the uncertain light. Meanwhile, the British soldiers, fighting from prepared positions, could more easily identify targets silhouetted against the night sky. Private William Jones, positioned near the corner of the storehouse, witnessed one of the most remarkable displays of courage when a young Zulu warrior managed to reach the top of the barricade. The warrior stood for a moment, outlined against the flickering light of burning grass that had been ignited by muzzle flashes, before hurling his assegai at the nearest British soldier. Jones brought up his rifle and fired, but not before the warrior had demonstrated the kind of individual bravery that characterized both sides in this desperate struggle. The sound of battle was unlike anything the defenders had experienced before. The sharp crack of rifle fire mixed with the war cries of attacking warriors, the thud of assegais striking the barricades, and the shouts of officers trying to coordinate their men's responses. Above it all, the war drums continued their rhythmic beating, maintaining the tempo of assault that seemed designed to wear down the defenders' resistance through sheer relentless pressure. As the third hour of fighting began, both sides had gained valuable insights into their opponent's capabilities. The Zulu commanders recognized that direct frontal assaults against the prepared defenses were too costly to sustain indefinitely. They began to focus their attacks on specific weak points, particularly the hospital building and the corners of the perimeter where the defensive walls were lowest. For their part, the British defenders had learned to conserve their ammunition more carefully, taking aimed shots rather than firing volleys into the darkness. The experienced soldiers shared their knowledge with younger comrades, teaching them to wait for clear targets and to make every shot count. This discipline would prove crucial as the night wore on and ammunition supplies began to run low. Lieutenant Chard found himself constantly moving between different sections of the defense, assessing the situation and making rapid decisions about where to concentrate his limited resources. The responsibility of command in such circumstances was overwhelming, but he drew strength from the steady performance of his men and the unwavering support of Lieutenant Bromhead. The battle had reached a critical phase where endurance became as important as courage. Both sides understood that the outcome would ultimately depend on which force could maintain their fighting effectiveness longest. For the Zulus, this meant continuing to press attacks despite mounting casualties. For the British, it meant holding their positions no matter what the cost, knowing that any breakthrough would likely mean the complete destruction of the garrison. The third hour of the siege brought a terrifying escalation, as several Zulu warriors managed to reach the hospital building and began attempting to break through its defenses. Private Henry Hook, defending the furthest room with 3 wounded patients, heard the sound of assegais striking the door and realized that their position was about to be overrun. "They're breaking through!" Hook shouted to Private John Williams in the adjacent room. The hospital had become a death trap, its multiple rooms and narrow corridors making coordinated defense nearly impossible. The original plan to use the building as a secondary stronghold was failing, as Zulu warriors found ways to penetrate the structure despite the defenders' efforts. Hook made a desperate decision that would save the lives of everyone in his section. Using his bayonet and the butt of his rifle, he began breaking through the wall that separated his room from the next. The stone and mortar construction was thick, but adrenaline and desperation gave him superhuman strength as he hammered at the barrier, while enemy warriors tried to break down the door behind him. Meanwhile, Private Williams was facing a similar crisis in his room, with Zulu warriors having gained entry through a window and advancing on the wounded soldiers under his protection. Williams fought a close-quarters battle with bayonet and rifle butt, his actions buying precious time for Hook to complete his improvised escape route. The sound of combat inside the hospital reached Lieutenant Chard, who realized that the building was being lost room by room. The original defensive plan had to be abandoned, and a new perimeter established that excluded the hospital entirely. This decision meant sacrificing the building they had worked so hard to fortify, but it was essential to prevent the Zulu breakthrough from rolling up their entire defensive line. Acting Commissary Dalton coordinated the withdrawal from the hospital with remarkable coolness under fire. He positioned covering fire teams to protect the evacuation, while Hook and Williams fought their way through the building, bringing out every wounded man they could carry. The retreat was conducted room by room, with each position held until the last possible moment, to allow the evacuation to continue. Private Joseph Williams, no relation to John Williams, distinguished himself during this phase by voluntarily returning to the burning hospital multiple times to rescue wounded comrades. Despite the increasing danger in the flames that were now spreading through parts of the building, he refused to abandon anyone who could be saved. The loss of the hospital forced a dramatic reduction in the size of the defensive perimeter. The remaining garrison now had to hold a much smaller area centered around the storehouse, but this concentration actually increased their defensive firepower per yard of perimeter. The new position was more compact and easier to coordinate, though it also meant that the defenders were now packed into a much smaller space under increasingly intense pressure. Lieutenant Bromhead reorganized his men into the new defensive positions with professional efficiency, but everyone could see that their situation was becoming desperate. Ammunition was running low despite careful conservation, and several men had been wounded during the hospital evacuation. The Zulu forces, meanwhile, showed no signs of weakening their assault. The fire that had started in the hospital began to spread to other parts of the mission station, creating an eerie battlefield illuminated by flickering orange flames. The light actually helped the defenders by revealing approaching attackers, but it also made their own positions more visible to Zulu marksmen who had captured some British rifles during the earlier fighting. Private Frederick Hitch, despite being wounded in the shoulder during the hospital evacuation, refused to withdraw from the firing line. He propped his rifle on the barricade and continued to engage targets with deadly accuracy, his experience as a marksman proving invaluable in the close-range fighting. His example inspired other wounded men to remain at their posts despite their injuries. The intensity of the combat reached levels that tested human endurance to the breaking point. Some British soldiers fired so many rounds that their rifle barrels became too hot to handle, forcing them to wrap cloth around the metal to continue shooting. The smell of gunpowder was so thick that men could barely breathe, and the constant noise of battle had left many partially deaf. But it was during this darkest hour that the true character of both sides became most evident. Zulu warriors continued to press attacks with unwavering courage, despite horrific casualties, while British soldiers held their positions with grim determination, even as their ammunition ran dangerously low. Private Robert Jones found himself in a position where he could observe individual acts of heroism on both sides. He watched a young Zulu warrior carry a wounded comrade to safety under heavy fire, then return immediately to continue the assault. On his own side, he saw Private William Jones distribute the last of his personal ammunition to men whose supplies had run out, keeping only a few rounds for himself. The psychological pressure of the siege was as intense as the physical danger. The defenders could hear the sound of thousands of warriors surrounding their position, chanting and singing war songs that spoke of death and victory. The knowledge that they were completely cut off, with no possibility of rescue or reinforcement, weighed heavily on every man's mind. Lieutenant Chard found himself making impossible decisions as the night progressed. With ammunition running low, he had to decide which positions could be maintained and which would have to be abandoned. Each choice meant asking men to hold hopeless positions or to withdraw from hard-won ground, decisions that would haunt any commander but were essential for the survival of the garrison. The fire in the hospital reached its peak during the 4th hour of fighting, sending a column of sparks and smoke high into the night sky. The building that had sheltered wounded men and served as a symbol of civilization in the wilderness was being consumed by flames that cast dancing shadows across the battlefield. Private Henry Hook, who had fought so desperately to save the hospital patients, stood at the new perimeter and watched the building burn. The sight filled him with mixed emotions, grief for what was lost, but also pride in knowing that they had saved every man who could be saved. His actions during the evacuation would later be recognized with the Victoria Cross, but at that moment he was simply a soldier doing his duty under impossible circumstances. The Zulu commanders, observing the fire in the reduced British perimeter, sensed that their enemy was weakening. They began to concentrate their forces for what they hoped would be the final assault that would overwhelm the remaining defenders. Fresh regiments were brought forward to replace those that had suffered heavy casualties, maintaining the pressure that had characterized the entire battle. As the 5th hour of fighting began, both sides understood that the siege was approaching its climax. The British garrison had been reduced to fewer than 100 effective defenders, holding a perimeter that could be crossed in a few dozen steps. They were low on ammunition, many were wounded, and all were exhausted by hours of continuous combat. Yet somehow, their resistance continued. Every man understood that surrender was not an option, not because of military discipline or fear of courts-martial, but because they had witnessed the aftermath of Isandlwana and knew what defeat would mean. They would fight until the last round was fired and the last man fell, holding their ground not just for the British Empire, but for each other. The bonds forged between these men during their desperate struggle transcended normal military relationships. They had shared the ultimate test of human courage and found that they would not abandon each other no matter what the cost. This brotherhood, born in the crucible of battle, would give them the strength to continue fighting, even when logic suggested that all hope was lost. As dawn began to break over the blood-soaked mission station, both sides paused to assess the devastation that 12 hours of continuous fighting had wrought. The British defenders, reduced to barely 70 effective soldiers, looked out over a battlefield littered with evidence of the night's ferocious combat. Zulu warriors had paid a terrible price for their repeated assaults, with hundreds of casualties scattered around the defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Chard, his uniform torn and blackened by smoke, surveyed his remaining men with a mixture of pride and concern. They had achieved the impossible by holding their position through the night, but their situation remained desperate. Ammunition was critically low, with many soldiers down to their last few rounds. Several men were seriously wounded but continued to man their positions, knowing that any weakness in the defense could prove fatal. The burning hospital had finally collapsed during the pre-dawn hours, sending a shower of sparks across the compound that had threatened to ignite the storehouse containing their remaining ammunition. Only the heroic efforts of men like Private William Jones, who repeatedly doused the roof with precious water, had prevented a catastrophe that would have ended all resistance. Private Frederick Hitch, despite his wounded shoulder and complete exhaustion, remained at his post on the corner of the storehouse. His marksmanship had been crucial during the night's fighting, and he estimated that he had fired over 200 rounds at attacking warriors. His rifle barrel was so hot from continuous use that steam rose from it in the cool morning air. The Zulu forces, though bloody by their costly assaults, showed no signs of abandoning their attack. Fresh regiments could be seen moving into position, replacing those that had borne the brunt of the night's fighting. Their commanders understood that the British position was weakening, and that one final concentrated assault might succeed where so many others had failed. Acting Commissary Dalton, who had been everywhere during the night's fighting, took stock of their remaining supplies. The ammunition situation was critical. At their current rate of consumption, they had perhaps enough cartridges for one more major engagement. Water was also running low, and several men were showing signs of heat exhaustion despite the cool morning air. But it was the psychological state of the defenders that concerned the officers most. These men had been pushed beyond normal human limits, fighting continuously for 12 hours against overwhelming odds. Some showed signs of nervous exhaustion, their hands shaking as they tried to reload their rifles. Others seemed to have reached a state of grim resignation, understanding that they had probably seen their last sunrise. Lieutenant Bromhead moved among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement and checking on the wounded. His calm presence had been a source of strength throughout the siege, and he continued to project confidence, even though he privately shared Shard's concerns about their ability to withstand another major assault. The brief lull in fighting allowed the defenders to make crucial preparations for what everyone expected to be the final phase of the battle. Wounded men who could no longer handle rifles were assigned to distribute ammunition and assist with reloading. Every cartridge was counted and allocated to ensure that the most experienced marksmen had sufficient rounds for the coming engagement. Private Henry Hook, exhausted by his heroic efforts during the hospital evacuation, found a moment to rest against the storehouse wall. The events of the night had transformed him from a hospital orderly into a combat veteran, and he reflected on the extraordinary circumstances that had revealed reserves of courage he never knew he possessed. The sight of the sun rising over the Natal landscape brought mixed emotions to the defenders. On one hand, they had survived the night against all expectations, achieving something that military historians would later describe as miraculous. On the other hand, daylight would make their weakened state more apparent to the enemy and would facilitate more coordinated attacks against their reduced perimeter. As if responding to this threat, the Zulu commanders began organizing what appeared to be their largest assault yet. Regiments that had been held in reserve during the night were brought forward, their shields and spears glinting in the morning sunlight. The sight of fresh troops preparing to attack was demoralizing for defenders who had hoped that their enemy was as exhausted as they were. Private Robert Jones, who had maintained his position throughout the siege, checked his remaining ammunition with growing concern. He had fewer than 10 rounds left, and he knew that most of his comrades were in similar situations. The Martini Henry rifles that had served them so well during the night would be useless once their ammunition was exhausted. But the morning also brought an unexpected development that would change the entire dynamic of the siege. Lookouts on the storehouse roof reported movement on the distant hills, movement that appeared to be organized troops approaching the mission station. The question was whether these were additional Zulu forces or the relief that everyone had given up hoping for. Lieutenant Shard climbed to the highest point available to get a better view of the approaching force. Through his field glasses, he could make out what appeared to be British cavalry and infantry, moving rapidly toward Rorke's Drift. Lord Chelmsford, having learned of the disaster at Isandlwana and fearing for the safety of his remaining forces, was rushing back to establish a defensive line at the Buffalo River. The news of approaching relief spread quickly among the defenders, bringing a surge of hope that helped counteract their physical exhaustion. But they also realized that the relief force was still hours away, and they would have to survive at least one more major assault before help could arrive. The Zulu commanders had also spotted the approaching British column, and this knowledge added urgency to their preparations. They understood that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and that they must overwhelm the mission station defense before the relief force could intervene. What followed was the most intense fighting of the entire siege. The Zulu assault was coordinated from multiple directions simultaneously, with warriors advancing under cover of supporting fire from captured British rifles. The defenders, knowing that relief was approaching, found the strength to resist with renewed determination. Private William Jones, down to his last 3 cartridges, made each shot count with the precision of a professional hunter. Beside him, Private Joseph Williams continued to move wounded men to safety despite his own injuries, his actions epitomizing the selfless courage that had characterized the entire defense. The fighting reached its peak intensity just as the relief column came into view on the distant ridge. The sight of Lord Chelmsford's cavalry moving at full gallop toward the mission station caused the Zulu assault to falter as warriors looked over their shoulders at the approaching enemy. But the defenders could not relax their vigilance yet. The relief force was still 20 minutes away, and desperate Zulu warriors continued to press their attacks with the fury of men who knew their opportunity was slipping away. The final phase of the siege would test the garrison's endurance, one last time before salvation finally arrived. Lieutenant Shard, watching the approaching cavalry through the smoke of battle, felt a surge of emotion that merely overwhelmed him. They had done it, somehow, impossibly. They had held their position through the longest night of their lives and survived until relief arrived. But the battle was not over yet, and he forced himself to concentrate on the immediate task of keeping his men alive for just a few more minutes. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats mixed with the final crashes of gunfire as Lord Chelmsford's relief column charged toward the mission station. The Zulu warriors, caught between the defenders they had been attacking all night and the fresh British force approaching from behind, faced an impossible tactical situation. Some regiments began to withdraw in good order, while others continued their assault in desperate attempts to achieve the victory that had seemed within their grasp moments before. Lieutenant Chard watched in amazement as the 17th Lancers swept around the mission station, their sabers glinting in the morning sunlight as they pursued withdrawing Zulu forces across the veldt. The sight of mounted soldiers moving freely across ground that had been dominated by enemy forces all night seemed almost surreal, after the claustrophobic intensity of the siege. The relief of the garrison was immediate and overwhelming. Private Frederick Hitch, who had maintained his position despite his wounded shoulder, finally allowed himself to sink to the ground. As cavalry troopers secured the perimeter, his rifle, which had fired hundreds of rounds during the night, lay beside him too hot to touch, testimony to the intensity of the fighting they had endured. Lord Chelmsford himself rode into the compound, his face grim as he surveyed the devastation that surrounded the mission station. The bodies of Zulu warriors lay scattered around the defensive perimeter, evidence of the repeated assaults that had been repulsed throughout the night. The burned-out shell of the hospital stood as a monument to the desperate nature of the fighting. The general's first concern was for the wounded, and medical personnel from the relief column immediately began treating men who had continued fighting despite serious injuries. Private Henry Hook, exhausted by his heroic efforts during the hospital evacuation, was among those who required immediate attention, though he protested that others needed help more urgently. As the immediate medical crisis was addressed, Lord Chelmsford began to piece together the full story of what had occurred at Rorke's Drift. The reports he received from Lieutenant Chard and Lieutenant Bromhead seemed almost incredible. 150 men had held off an army of 4,000 for 12 hours, inflicting massive casualties while suffering relatively light losses themselves. The defensive preparations, improvised under extreme pressure, impressed even experienced military engineers who examined them in daylight. The mealy-bag walls, ammunition box redoubts, and converted hospital positions showed remarkable ingenuity in adapting civilian structures for military purposes. Acting Commissary Dalton's contributions to the defense were immediately recognized as crucial to the garrison's survival. Private Robert Jones, who had fought at one of the most exposed positions throughout the siege, was among the first to be interviewed by Lord Chelmsford's staff officers. His account of the repeated Zulu assaults and the defensive tactics that had proved effective provided valuable intelligence for future operations in the region. The ammunition count revealed just how close the garrison had come to being overwhelmed. Most defenders had fewer than 5 rounds remaining when the relief arrived, and some positions had been reduced to fighting with bayonets and improvised weapons. The discipline shown in conserving ammunition during the most intense fighting had been essential to their survival. As word of the defense spread through the relief column, soldiers who had experienced the disaster at Isandlwana looked at the Rorke's Drift defenders with something approaching awe. Here was proof that British soldiers could defeat Zulu warriors when properly positioned and led, a morale boost desperately needed after the shock of the earlier defeat. The Zulu withdrawal was conducted with the same military discipline that had characterized their assault. Despite suffering heavy casualties, they maintained their unit organization and retreated in good order, carrying their wounded and leaving no weapons or equipment behind. Their courage during the siege had earned the respect of every British soldier who witnessed it. Lieutenant Bromhead, whose steady leadership had been crucial during the darkest hours of the siege, found himself overwhelmed by the recognition being offered by senior officers. His calm competence under extreme pressure had helped hold the defense together when panic could have proved fatal. The civilian missionaries and their families, who had been evacuated before the siege began, returned to find their mission station transformed into a battlefield. Otto Witt's residence had been damaged by stray bullets, while the hospital he had worked so hard to establish lay in ruins, its medical supplies scattered or destroyed by fire. As the day progressed, the full strategic significance of the defense became apparent. By holding Rorke's Drift, the garrison had prevented the Zulu army from crossing into Natal unopposed, buying crucial time for the colonial government to organize additional defenses. Their sacrifice had potentially saved thousands of civilian lives. The stories of individual heroism that emerged from interviews with the defenders would become legendary in British military history. Private William Jones's distribution of his personal ammunition, Private Joseph Williams's repeated rescue missions, and Private Henry Hook's breakthrough evacuation of the hospital patients were just a few of the extraordinary acts of courage that had characterized the defense. Medical examination revealed the physical toll that 12 hours of continuous combat had taken on the defenders. Many suffered from hearing damage caused by prolonged exposure to rifle fire in enclosed spaces. Others showed signs of nervous exhaustion that would require weeks of rest to overcome. The aftermath of the siege also revealed the human cost of such intense fighting. Several defenders required treatment for what would later be recognized as combat stress, their minds struggling to process the extreme experiences they had endured. The bonds formed during that night of desperate fighting would connect these men for the rest of their lives. Lord Chelmsford's official dispatch, describing the defence of Rorke's Drift, would eventually reach London, where it provided a rare piece of good news during a colonial campaign that had begun disastrously. The Victoria Cross recommendations that followed would recognise the exceptional courage displayed by ordinary soldiers under extraordinary circumstances. As evening fell on January 23rd, the mission station that had witnessed such heroism was secured and peaceful once again. The defenders, finally able to rest after their ordeal, reflected on what they had accomplished through their refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The defence of Rorke's Drift had demonstrated that ordinary men, when properly led and motivated, could achieve seemingly impossible things. The small garrison had faced odds of more than 25 to 1, and had not merely survived, but had won a decisive defensive victory that would be studied in military academies for generations. Private Frederick Hitch, his wounded shoulder properly bandaged, looked out over the veldt where so much blood had been spilled during the night. The peaceful landscape gave no hint of the drama that had unfolded there, but he knew that none of the survivors would ever forget the night when they discovered reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. The mission station at Rorke's Drift had been transformed from a quiet outpost into a symbol of military valor that would inspire British soldiers for decades to come. More importantly, it had proved that even in the darkest circumstances, when hope seemed lost and defeat appeared certain, the human spirit could triumph over impossible odds through courage, determination, and brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared danger. The last stand at Rorke's Drift had ended, but its legacy would endure as one of the most remarkable defensive actions in military history, a testament to the extraordinary things that ordinary people can achieve when they refuse to surrender in the face of overwhelming adversity.